Hey guys, this is heyybritny and welcome to my channel, and today we're going to be talking about the Candace and Tucker Carlson interview as well as Nick Fuentes since he was wrapped up in that conversation. So let's just go ahead and talk about the interview with Candace and Tucker. So I found the most interesting part of that interview to be the conversation around Tucker's dad. Everything that Candace talked about in this interview I've already heard either from her own show or from other interviews that she's done. So I didn't feel like I was learning anything new necessarily. So this is actually an interview that I kind of tuned out in bits and pieces of it. I found it really hard to stay focused throughout the whole thing just because I know that she's done an interview with Tucker Carlson before, and then also I know that basically I'm up to date on as far as anything that she said on her TV show and all of that good stuff. And so again, the most interesting part was them talking about the Nick Fuentes interview that she did. That was interesting to me because one, we know that the interview with Nick was put behind a paywall. She got a lot of backlash as far as how she conducted the interview. And then prior to the interview being available, I think maybe on a Thursday or something like that, Nick did an episode. He talked about his experience and kind of told people how he felt about the interview, and then the interview dropped the next day. And so he said a lot in that episode that he did about Candace. Basically, he talked about how he felt it was a setup. They were focused on drama. They weren't talking about current events, and that she wanted to focus on things that he felt didn't matter. And he felt like it was a missed opportunity to debate on different topics, which is, I think, what a lot of people wanted them to do. And I posted a video on my thoughts on the interview. You can go ahead and check that out. So we're not going to rehash that interview too much, but I was kind of disappointed in this interview that Candace did with Tucker Carlson that she did not address what Nick said point for point. So he said a lot. He said, hey, I asked her about, is this going to be a friendly interview? She said, laugh out loud, I don't set people up. And then the conversation about the paywall, I can't recall if he said that he knew it was going to be behind a paywall, but he didn't think she was serious. And then when she brought it up, I guess at the end of the interview, they had that conversation about it. And then he was like, okay, whatever. And then I guess they texted about it after he aired his thoughts about the interview. So I would have liked it if she would have addressed those point for point, because basically what she said in the interview with Tucker Carlson was that she didn't know why he reacted like that. He reacted one way when he was with her, and then he went on the internet and did something else. And then she also talked about how she felt like, hey, I thought everything went good. I felt like he was lonely. We wanted to invite him back for dinner. I don't know if they actually did or not, but she was just, I guess, telling us what her thought process was. And then also she talked about how she gave him marriage advice or whatever and he didn't receive it well. And then she brought up how she gave that same kind of messaging or talk or lecture to Andrew Tate. And I actually went back and looked at both what she said to Nick Fuentes and then also what she said to Andrew Tate. And what she said to Andrew Tate, that was much more aspirational. Her energy is completely different. She's almost glowing and very feminine and smiling in that interview. And so it's more easy to receive what she's saying because she's talking so positively about marriage, and she's trying to convert Andrew Tate, and you can see that he's smiling when she's talking, and he's kind of intrigued by what she's saying. Whereas in the interview with Nick, she's like, oh, you're selfish. This is another way to say what you said. I think you're not willing to give up yourself, and then marriage will change you and blah, blah, blah. And I'm pretty sure, if I recall correctly, she may have said something about him being lost earlier in the interview. So again, in this interview, it wasn't a friendly interview at times, and your energy was completely different than your energy with Andrew Tate. I feel like with Andrew Tate, it was like two old friends talking, and it was just kind of like, it didn't feel hostile. It didn't feel like she was there to put him in his place or anything like that. And so the energy with Nick Fuentes was completely different. So that's why the message didn't land the same way as what she said to Andrew Tate. And then there's also the differences of what they were wearing. So I know that Candace did a interview with Russell Brand, and in that interview, a lot of people said, hey, we like your hair, we like your outfit, that sort of thing. And it was a very feminine outfit. It was like white and yellow. She had her hair in French braid, and then front pieces hanging down to frame her face. And then she also, I feel like, was more open in that interview. Whereas with Nick, what I noticed after the fact was that she was kind of dressed down for her. She had some sort of zip up, and then and maybe just like, I don't know if she had yoga pants, but some sort of like dark pants. And then Nick showed up in a suit. So I thought that contrast was very interesting, because normally we see her, she's dressed up, she looks nice and all of that stuff. She definitely could not have worn what she wore with Russell Brand, because I think that just would have made the interview look a little silly. Her kind of overly feminine and bright colors, even though yellow and white are kind of more neutral, it just would have been the wrong outfit to wear for that interview with Nick Fuentes. So I think in addition to the energy being completely different than the energy she had with Andrew Tate, in the interview with Nick Fuentes, she was dressed down, she was more kind of closed off, she was laughing and joking here and there, she was also getting her digs in, and so I feel like that's why the message didn't land the same, even if she had the same intention to encourage him to get married, to encourage him to have a family and all of that stuff. And so I think that that's the part that she's may still not be getting about the interview and all of the feedback about it, but those are just my 2 cents on that topic. Moving on, Candace also talked about a lot of the same topics that Nick talked about. She said, hey, we talked about a paywall, we talked about inserting clips, and then she made this point to say, hey, if he had come to me in good faith and said, hey, can you edit this part out? I don't like the way that this sounds. And I don't really think that was his issue at all. I don't think there was anything that he said that he was like, oh, that makes me look bad the way I said it, blah, blah, blah. He was more concerned about the energy of the interview and how she treated him and just kind of like what his expectations were for the interview. So I thought that was kind of not a good comment to make, because that wasn't the core issue. The core issue wasn't that you edited the clip in a way to make him look bad. I know that he talked about how she edited the trailer and spliced together 2 different moments to make it look like he was either hesitating on the answer or gave a different answer. That was just one thing that he talked about, but I felt like his general point was he didn't like the interview because they talked about the wrong topics. She was hostile, she wasn't friendly, and all of that stuff. And so I wish that she could have addressed that point for point in her interview with Tucker Carlson. Okay, moving on. The other big moment was everything about Nick Fuentes, in addition to the conversation around Tucker Carlson's dad. In the interview with Candace, Tucker Carlson is talking about a moment that he had, or an exchange that he had, where someone sent him a clip of Nick Fuentes talking about his dad, and he's like, hey, how does this guy know who my dad is? My dad's 84, this kid is 26, blah, blah, blah. So he's saying that they're basically not in the same age group to where Nick should know about his dad, which is kind of stupid, because if your dad's a public figure, anybody can just Google him and find out about him. So I was really confused by that. Like, what does his age have to do with whether or not he knows your dad or not, or knows of your dad? Because again, you can either Google people if they're famous or well-known enough that they would have information about them on the internet, or if you know people who would know the history of your dad and all of that stuff. And so I didn't understand that argument that, hey, this kid is only 26, he shouldn't know enough information to even know what my dad did, that sort of thing. So I found that super interesting. And then also the weird gay kid in the basement comment got a lot of traction, and I really liked how Nick talked about this. He talked about, hey, this is your audience. Your audience is people, white men in particular, who are not able to afford a home, so they move in with their parents. Everybody pretty much did that during COVID. If you weren't able to stay in your apartment, or if you wanted to not be isolated, you moved back home. I had a coworker who actually moved from New York to Arizona because she, I guess, didn't want to be in New York by herself. She was in a studio apartment and all of that stuff, and so she just moved back home with her family temporarily. And so a lot of people did that, and so I definitely liked what Nick was calling out and saying, hey, this is your target audience, this is who you're speaking to, and you're talking down to them. You guys are millionaires, you guys have big houses, you guys have a big platform, but then you're also criticizing the people who are going to be listening to you, who are going to be following you, and it shouldn't matter if those kids are in their basement or whatever. You know what I mean? I think there's a difference between living in your parents' basement because you're saving up for something versus living in your parents' basement because you're not trying to do anything, you're not trying to amount to anything, you're not setting goals, you're just literally in your parents' basement wasting time playing video games and not doing anything of substance. I think those are 2 different scenarios. And then additionally, Candace is always saying, hey, I'm just a mom in my basement, so I did see a lot of people pointing that out, like, hey, she is this person with a big platform, but when she gets in trouble or when she gets in controversy or whatever, she's like, hey, I'm just a mom of 3, a mom of 4 in my basement filming and all of this stuff. And so when is it okay to be in the basement is the point of this conversation. And so I thought that that was interesting because it doesn't really matter where he's filming from. It matters if what he's saying is factually correct. We know that he makes jokes that are kind of offensive or he oversells it to make his point, which can be offensive and triggering to some people, but it doesn't matter where he's filming his show. What matters is that he's saying stuff that people want to listen to, that people are engaging with, and that people are coming back for more of his content. Okay, so getting back to Tucker Carlson's dad, so Nick definitely said a lot about him. Basically, Dick Carlson was a guy who was in charge of something called Voice of America, and what the internet says is this was an international multimedia broadcaster funded by the U.S. government, providing news, information, and cultural programming to a global audience. Established in 1942 during World War II, its initial purpose was to counter Nazi propaganda and bolster Allied morale. VOA's mission expanded during the Cold War to promote American values and disseminate objective news to countries with limited access to free information. So basically, this is getting out communications to wherever your target audience is and then controlling what that communications is. So he pointed out that, hey, your dad was involved with this. You yourself are a broadcaster, journalist. You communicate news to the people. You work for organizations that have a certain message to spread. And so he was just basically talking about, hey, your dad worked for the CIA. You tried to join the CIA and all of this stuff. And I know that there was a thing where Putin brought this up when he had that interview with Tucker, and he brought up like, hey, you tried to get into the CIA, you weren't accepted, blah, blah, blah. And then I think Nick brought up the point where, if your dad was so high up working with the CIA and all of that stuff, why weren't you able to get in? And so that's the personal dig and all of that stuff. And then also what he brought up was that Tucker himself has kind of been involved in certain situations that have either impacted a region or impacted elections in that region. And so there was just a lot of stuff that he brought up that kind of made Tucker look bad. And Tucker should have to go on the defensive to explain or to validate whatever Nick was saying, because what started this whole thing was that Tucker was saying, hey, I was sent a clip of Nick talking about my dad. I didn't know where he got this information. And then what Tucker, to continue the story, what he says is, I found out after my dad died in March of this year, 2025, hey, my dad actually was in the CIA. There were the clips circulating on social media, and then Nick talked about this himself, where I guess Tucker did an interview in June of 2024, and he's talking about his dad being in the CIA. And I did see one comment where it was like, hey, Nick, he's retelling a earlier situation. I really didn't get that comment because in the interview with Candace, he clearly says, my dad passed away in March of this year, and I found out after, and then we have this stuff in June 2024. So it didn't really feel like he was talking about something that happened earlier this year, but that doesn't account for what he said in June of 2024. And so I found that really interesting, because is Tucker Carlson caught in a lie? If so, how is he going to address this? How is he going to rebound? So this is all very interesting stuff, because the whole point of this conversation is that they were basically saying, hey, Nick's a Fed, he's a CIA, he is intentionally trying to discredit right-wing voices, he's getting in the mix and he's kind of disrupting things, and he's doing it deliberately and all of this stuff. And so I don't know if any of that is true. I don't know if I imagine that different people would perceive things differently depending on what they know, what their goals are, and all of that stuff. And so all of this, needless to say, was very interesting that they were talking about this on public platforms. So Candace and Tucker talked about a little bit of it on their platform when they had their interview, and then Nick had his rebuttal. Obviously, Nick was not a part of his interview, so he was not able to chime in live, but it was good that he did come on air and give his rebuttal. Now, moving on to YouTube and just social media in general and influencers. So I've been seeing a lot more of Nick's content on YouTube. I believe he said he was unbanned, or other people said that he was unbanned. I'm not 100% sure, but we are seeing a influx of his interviews and his comments on YouTube, at least I am. And so I came across 3 different interviews talking about Nick, or interviews with Nick himself. So the first one was Brad Martin. This was an interview that was was posted on July 30th. This was the best interview that I've seen with him since Candace, and I really liked this interview with Brad because one, I think it was like a almost 3-hour conversation, and they got into so many different topics, and we were able to hear his ideas more fully than we did in the Candace interview. So I was really excited about that, really happy about that. People said that they felt like Brad was asking like basic questions, and I think that he asked the right questions and he pushed back in the right ways, because you have to think of the average viewer and what they know. And so I really like that Brad communicated in basic terms. Like, he didn't always know all of the facts or recall all of the facts. He didn't have all of the right terms and stuff like that, but he knew the general point of what he was trying to ask, and Nick was able to pick up on what he was saying and actually kind of fill in the blanks and give his perspective. And so I really like that they were able to have a back and forth conversation about different topics and kind of clarifying where Nick stood. And the one thing that did bother me a little bit was that Nick would start to talk and then Brad would cut him off, and then he wouldn't get to finish and all of that stuff. And then at times Brad did talk for a long time, and so Nick was just sitting there listening and kind of trying to follow along and all of that stuff, and then he was able to respond. But overall, I thought this was a really good interview. I liked that they put it on YouTube. It wasn't behind a paywall. And the interesting thing was that there was, at the time that I saw it, there was 624 or 27,000 people who had watched the episode, and I can't imagine how many people watched Candace's interview with Nick. And she charged $199 to buy the episode to watch it, and I don't know how many people actually bought it. So I was thinking maybe 100,000 people bought it, 40,000 people. I was trying to, I guess, ballpark what she made off of that interview. I thought that an interview with Nick Fuentes was going to be in the millions. So Brad Martin's interview is not quite there yet, but it hasn't been out that long, and I have no idea what it's at now. But I just can't imagine if there are this many people interested in what Nick has to say and you're charging for it. That just makes it crazy how much money people can make off of this one interview. And I do think people should be paid for the work that they do, but they shouldn't try to monetize it in a way where it's done the way that Candace did it, because she could have found other ways to give the interview for free to people, and she would have made that back in YouTube ads or whatever. So I think that this was a missed opportunity, because there's this interview with Brad Martin, there's the one with Jake Shields, I guess was from last year, and he's just now putting it up. It may have been available on Rumble all of this time, but this is the first time that I'm seeing it. So that was posted on July 23rd. And then I also saw an interview from a channel called Right Response that was posted on August 2nd, and I actually was a little misled, or I felt misled, because in the thumbnail they have a picture of maybe 2 or 3 people plus Nick. So I thought it was an interview with Nick, because I was combing YouTube for interviews with Nick that I could listen to just to kind of get more information about him. And I was annoyed because they were just talking about Nick in theory or whatever. He wasn't actually on the show, so I did feel a little bit confused by that. But I did also learn some very interesting stuff in that Right Response podcast episode, so that was good that I came across that. There's stuff in there that I don't necessarily agree with, but I was exposed to something new. With the Jake Shields interview, I only watched like about 56 minutes of that, and then I got distracted and had to do something else. I thought the interview was okay. What I didn't like about it was that basically Jake Shields basically affirmed or validated everything that Nick said, so it wasn't like there was a whole lot of pushback. He did have the opportunity to tell his story and to speak and all of that stuff, but I just felt like it was like basically the same type of person talking to himself or whatever, and so there wasn't a whole lot of pushback. So I really liked the Brad Martin interview just for that aspect of Brad pushing back and kind of making Nick have to give a rebuttal or to clarify his stances to help it make more sense so that people can understand what he's trying to say. Alrighty, so to wrap up this episode, quite a lot happened between Candace Tucker and Nick. I'm super curious to see how everyone's going to respond to this between the 3 people now that we've had some time in between those interviews and all of that stuff. I really do wish that Candace Tucker and Nick would sit down and do a 3-person interview. I think that being that Candace had Nick to her home, Tucker had Candace to his home, I think that Candace and Tucker need to go to Nick's place, be on his turf, and let him lead or host the interview, because Candace already had an opportunity to monetize the interview with Nick. Tucker's obviously monetizing the interview with Candace, so I think that Nick should get his opportunity to monetize the conversation between the three of them. I would be down for that interview. I don't know how well it would go. I don't know who is going to necessarily moderate. Oh, maybe they need a moderator. Nick should host it and put it on his platform, but they should have somebody else moderate it just to kind of keep the egos in check and kind of give everyone equal opportunity to speak and all of that stuff. I've been watching a lot of Piers Morgan Uncensored. I don't know if he would be a good moderator for that conversation, because I know that he says, hey, you know, it's my show and I'm going to talk over people, but he doesn't want the guests to talk over people. And so sometimes it is on his panel, it is hard to hear people, because when you have different video feeds, like you have 4 different people, but they're all in separate places with their own audio feeds and all of that stuff, it's really hard to kind of get control of that. Like, I wish that he would just mute people's screens or their audio at times when they're over speaking, and just kind of like let them speak when it's their turn and let them be audible when it's their turn. But I don't know if he's gonna do any of that or whatever. But I would like to see all 3 of them in the same space, in the same building, not on separate video feeds or all of that stuff. So I think that a interview with those 3 people and Piers Morgan would be good. Those are just my thoughts. I don't know if you guys think that it would be better with just the 3 of them, or if there's someone else who could moderate that conversation. But I do think that this would be a even bigger conversation than the separate interviews I've seen so far, and I would be down for that for sure. So yeah, those are my thoughts on Candace, Tucker, and Nick. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.